other way, there is enough democracy. Now, we saw an election in 2019 where a government was returned with an emphatic and, may I say so, a pretty categorical mandate. Now, that government went ahead and did what it was there in its manifesto. As a result of this, there were some people who were dissatisfied, and they expressed their dissatisfaction by coming out into the streets. Now, just because they came out into the streets doesn't necessarily mean that was when democracy asserted itself. Whereas how the parliament, when parliament enacted legislation, that was undemocratic, and that was the stifling of dissent. There are voices. There are voices which are in favor of certain things. There are other voices of elected representatives, of which Shashi happens to be one of them, who make their positions clear. And just because there are some people who claim themselves to be intellectuals or represent one particular section of society, which, for instance, had misgivings over the CAA, or one section of society which have misgivings over the new agricultural laws, that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the country is supportive of them. Those who don't come out into the streets are not necessarily in support of this. But the mere fact that people can come out into the streets puts paid to the very basis, to that very spurious theory that there is no democracy in India. There is democracy. There is a robust debate going on. There's a very lively exchange of views. Just because some of those views are not articulated by people who have the stamp of intellectuals on their on their hand, that doesn't necessarily mean that those views amount to nothing, or that they're qualitatively or numerically, they should be discounted far more than anyone else's. I believe India is doing well. There have been some very profound and radical changes. And the abolition of Article 370, for example, was a profoundly historic event in India, which was passed. And obviously, I believe there were bound to be certain reactions which the government has to cope with. But it was done as a result of a democratic mandate of the people of India and passed through the legitimate way in Parliament. And I believe that we in India, on a year of pandemic, where there were difficulties here, we saw elections being held. We saw elections being also held in all the very difficult things like in Kashmir and in Ladakh. And we've also seen demonstrations, and we've also seen demonstrations in support or in opposition of the government. So legislation, parliament, electoral democracy are all in existence. So this idea that democracy has somehow been punctured is the whining of a loser.
May I whine back for another minute, Rajdeep?
Are you a whining loser? Why don't you whine back? Why don't you whine back, Dr. Tharoor?
Because I am a member of parliament and an elected one, unlike my good friend Swapan. And I do want to say that we have met for a grand total of 10 days since the lockdown was proclaimed, even though India is supposed to be an IT superpower with a tremendous capacity to be able to offer IT-enabled services to the world. We seem to be unable to find the technology or the political will to enable the technology to connect 543 Lok Sabha members together, or even 240-odd Rajya Sabha members together. So there's something clearly to be questioned about Swapan celebrating how often Parliament meets, Parliament meeting without parliamentary committees being able to pronounce on issues, rushing bills through in great haste, bills that have been converted from ordinances, and doing so without taking into account the views of the stakeholders most affected, in this case, the farmers themselves, does not suggest that Parliament is functioning as it should in a healthy parliamentary democracy. I don't think the farmers agitating in the streets outside Delhi and, in effect, gheraing the national capital are exactly intellectuals, as he disparaged them, or even members of losing parties. In fact, many of them have made it clear that they're not politicians and they don't want political parties on their platform. They're speaking for what's something viscerally relevant to their lives and livelihoods. And that's why they're out there. So I think some of these rather glib dismissals should be taken with a very, very sensible calm but generous pinch of salt. The truth is that there is some real concern in a democracy where opposition is dismissed as anti-national, in a place where a state can be unilaterally bifurcated and made into a union territory or a pair of union territories without consulting those concerned, where laws can be passed that affect the livelihoods of 60-odd% of the population without taking their views into account. I think it will be idle to suggest that all is well with our democracy. But I'm not joining the doomsayers who say that democracy is dead. I'm just saying that democracy exists. It needs to be fought for, it needs to be defended. And amongst the institutions required to make that democracy work would be a lively, functioning parliament, which is given a chance to meet. And if it can't meet because of COVID physically, let it meet virtually. Let the committees be allowed to connect their members so that they have quorums, instead of being told that people have to come physically all the way to Delhi and have other consequences when they attempt to go back to quarantine restrictions in their own states, which is why most parliamentary committees have had very few meetings. All of these things suggest a certain disinclination to permit the discussion, the deliberation that is the absolute substance on the essence of democracy. So that's why we believe, and I'm sure that's why Rahul Gandhi said that democracy increasingly exists in the imagination of people like Chopin and not in the lived experience of MPs and others who want to have their voices heard.
May I just pour some old wine in an old bottle?
Parliament.
May I just, in response to what Shashi has been saying?
I'm listening.
Firstly, I don't think Rahul Gandhi's intervention that there is a lack of democracy in India stems from his concern over Parliament not meeting, which incidentally is a very legitimate concern, which I share with Shashi, that yes, we should have greater enabled services, greater IT-enabled services, perhaps change some of the existing rules which prevent this from happening. Now, the reason why Rahul Gandhi said it is not because he's concerned with parliamentary democracy, but Parliament particularly, because he doesn't attend Parliament or the committees very frequently. I think the more important reason here is that there was a certain section of India which believed they had a total veto on policy making, especially radical ruptures from the past. And I think 370 was one of them, and I think the Farmers' Bill was yet another one of them. Those were the type of vetoes which existed. Now, when those vetoes get demolished, it is almost inevitable that certain reaction will take place. And that reaction will have to be done by negotiation, not by force. And those negotiations have been on, in a way, and there have been elections which again reinforce or reject a particular mandate. Now, again, we saw Bihar elections being fought, or the Delhi elections being fought. And Bihar is important because it was done after COVID came into it, and the turnout was quite encouraging. Now, in this climate, where the pandemic is a reality, where a lot of parliamentarians in that budget session around March 2020 expressed their horror that Parliament was actually meeting at a time like this. Now, for Parliament has met, I don't believe it's a very satisfactory meeting, someone sitting in one gallery and someone sitting in another gallery. That, the life is taken out of Parliament in a very way. So we have to find more innovative solutions of how, in case this pandemic persists, how we can get
it goes.
But just because
Swapan Dasgupta,
someone opposes something, someone opposes something, doesn't give that person the right to actually say, I have a veto over policy making in India. And I think policy making in India is something which is done by an elected government, taking into account all the pluses and the minuses. And the farmers, I certainly have believed that the farmers of Punjab, Western UP and Haryana certainly have question in their minds about the MSP. But there are large areas of India, including Bengal, where I've been active in the past year and a half, where, less than 5% of the farmers get MSP, where there is a crying need for greater investment in rural infrastructure, with the cold chain, etc., which are being facilitated by these agricultural reforms, which is why which there is a saying which says that for everything which is true about India, the opposite is equally true. And I think here we have a case where one section of India, one section of the farming community may be dissatisfied, but there are large sections somewhere else which are actually quite pleased that this sort of old this stagnant model has somehow been broken and we can actually get new investment in agriculture. But this is a debate. It's a very interesting debate. It's also a debate which is based on political calculation.
Can I just intervene?
And I'm glad it's happening.
Can I just intervene for a moment?
Democracy.
But can I just intervene though for a moment to give a fact? India has dropped 10 ranks to 51st position in Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index at the start of the year. And since Mr. Modi took over as Prime Minister, our rank slipped from 27 in 2014 to 51 now. I'm just wondering, Swapan Dasgupta, that beyond parliamentary democracy or the functioning of parliament, it is the seeming perception, if not the reality, of the untrammeled use of state power. When, for example, those who protested against Citizenship Amendment Act, many of them are arrested under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. When politicians in Jammu and Kashmir are detained for almost a year, all of that sends out the message that there is an unbridled use of state power against dissent. Sedition charges are framed against dissenters. They are called anti-nationals, tukre gang, urban Maoists. Does that create the perception somewhere that there is an untrammeled use of state power? Your response, and then I'll get Shashi to respond.
Some of them are undeniably the tukre gang, and some of them have no commitment to the integrity of India. Some of them see the emotional balkanization of India's thing, and political slogans which are being used, to counter that is part of it. But, if you come to this question of the Economist Intelligence Unit and organizations like that, which have expressed concern over the declining quality of Indian democracy, may I just say one thing? I think there's been one profound change in India over the past many years, 5 years, I would say. And that has been that the nature, that the decision-making apparatus has changed quite a lot. And I think many of the members of the Anshan regime, and I may even count myself as one of them, from that same sort of privileged social background, etc., have somehow been marginalized. And we are yielding space to a very different form of a new elite is really, a new political elite is emerging. And it is that, the inability of some of the people.
Now, are you telling me the Economist is part of the answer regime? Are you telling me, Dr. Dasgupta, the Economist is part of the answer regime?
Rajdeep, let me just tell you one more thing. As far as the CAA and others were concerned, I personally find it an absolute travesty that, there should be people who are demonstrating on this basis of a completely spurious claim and denying the persecution which has taken place, particularly in Eastern India, of a very large number of people who unfortunately happen to be Hindus. Now, we can obviously say, oh, no, we shouldn't actually admit that they're Hindus. We should actually pretend that it happened because, by accident, there was certain neighborhoods, which were selected for persecution across the border. The point that sometimes you actually change this language of very spurious secularism and go out and say it and tell it as it exactly is, you get a nasty reaction from people who call themselves intellectuals. And I believe that they have a certain right.
Okay,
it's exactly the same as we saw in the United States. There was no democracy. Democracy was in peril. And yet, after the results have come out, now democracy is back in its usual sort of way. Now, it's basically a verdict and say, look, what is happening? The government does not suit my tastes. Fair enough. The government, it's not meant to suit everyone's tastes. That's democracy. But doesn't mean it's gone. Democracy is gone. Bihar was the government was elected by a whisker. It could have been this way.
It doesn't necessarily mean it shouldn't necessarily mean, some would argue, the arrest of young student activists under UAPA and other such laws where they are denied repeated bail. But let Dr. Tharoor respond to what you've just said. Dr. Tharoor,
Right,
is there a discomfort among the old elite to what is happening? And is that what is the core of the arguments that are made, not just by Rahul Gandhi, but by many others, when they say that democracy is being diminished under Narendra Modi?
Well, of course, because the road to the new India that Mr. Modi talks about appears to be littered with the wreckage of all that was good and noble about the old India, the old ancien regime, as Chopin charmingly calls it. Because, in fact, what we're seeing is an ugly distortion of the Indian idea rising, one where an especially dangerous and perverted form of Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan kind of chauvinism is being fostered, and narrow-minded majoritarianism marked by incidents of communal violence, the entirely fictional crime of love jihad, which is putting real human beings in jail daily, driven by mob lynching zealots and Gaurakshak vigilantes. And this kind of, even beautiful slogans like Bharat Mata Ki Jai and Jai Shri Ram have become rallying cries of bigotry rather than expressions that Hindus are free as individuals to use as they wish or not use if they don't wish. You know, the fact is that when Chopin describes the kind of India that he's celebrating, he seems to completely overlook the examples you mentioned of the UAPA. I can talk about the sweeping powers of arrest and detention assumed by various states, ruled by the BJP and by the central government itself, the manner in which Jammu and Kashmir has been treated for the last couple of years, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which for the first time introduced a religious test for Indian citizenship by fast-tracking citizenship only for those refugees from neighboring countries who are not Muslim. So what happens, Chopin, to a Taslima Nasreen or a Dawood Haider or a Fahmid Riyaz, so many people who have come from our neighboring countries as refugees whom we have welcomed in the past and given homes to, but who apparently will not qualify under the CAA. I'm just running through a list of examples which seems never ending. I mean, the truth is that participatory democracy is not just about having free and fair elections in which, as Chopin says, his party nearly lost Bihar, so that shows democracy is healthy. I mean, I welcome the fact that at least our elections are still taking place, but the truth is they're taking place with the dice stacked in favor of the ruling party, thanks to things like the mysterious electoral bonds, 97% of which have only gone to the BJP, according to newspaper reports. And by the way, it's not just the Economist Intelligence Unit. The most respected V Democracy Institute in Sweden, which publishes an annual report, for the first time has said that there is a real question as to whether India even qualifies as a democracy anymore, given their detailed analysis of the things that are going on. So there's some real questions and concerns. The reason that people like me feel that we still have to continue to fight is because there is enough of democracy, enough institutions, enough free media, enough opportunities to stand up and say, no, you can't do this in my name. And these things are actually making the battle still worth waging. But the almost inexorable progress of this sort of ruling party juggernaut across the country has raised the concerns that other people outside have noticed. And as Rajdeep, you clearly implied with your question to Chopin, those are not members of the ancien regime. They have no stakes in our society. They're just observers, and they are seeing that our democracy is in peril. And by the way, Chopin, the very presence of the masses of farmers at the Delhi border, whose numbers are continuing to swell because of the injustice that they feel has been meted out to them by the new farm laws, suggests that the government has had little time for such formalities as consultative lawmaking. You may well be right. In Bengal, only 5% have the MSP. The same is true in other states. The APMC doesn't exist in my state of Kerala. The truth is, this is a large federal country. The very government that ran roughshod over federalism by imposing a nationwide lockdown, even though the constitution says that law and order is a state subject, the state governments were ordered to enforce a lockdown decreed by the Prime Minister in Delhi. Our federalism is also under serious threat. And now we are seeing, for example, that in the name of curbing the pandemic, federalism has been severely questioned. We've seen similarly with the Finance Commission that the extraordinarily increasing population of the Hindi heartland is now going to determine the bulk of the allocations of the finances of this country. There are serious questions about how much the original idea of the Indian Constitution of a federal republic, a union of states in which all of us have equal rights, where every citizen as an individual can exercise agency irrespective of their religion, their caste, their creed, their language. All of these are being questioned. I would say that the very experience of what it means to be an Indian is under question. And that's why my new book, The Battle of Belonging, is raising these fundamental questions. Because I believe that our democracy requires us to raise them without being dismissed as anti-national. And that the independent national institutions this government has been hollowing out and diluting are being openly used as instruments of a political agenda, whereas they were constitutional institutions that the government of the day was meant to leave alone. All of this, I think, makes it clear that the present dispensation is remaking our country into a populist, communalist, chauvinist, authoritarian, strictly marketed, I guarantee, but power-hungry kakistocracy supported by stoked-up vigilante mobs. I don't think that's a great advertisement for democracy in India today.
I think now, by now, I think I've got a very...
Those are lots of very long Tharoorisms. Those are lots of very long Tharoorisms in one sentence. But I think, let me sort of distill into asking you, Dr. Dasgupta, what is being suggested by Mr. Tharoor is effectively that we've become some kind of a majoritarian democracy, hollowing out our institutions, and where, in a sense, federalism and secularism as defined in the Constitution are under threat. Is that an exaggeration, or do you believe that there is some merit at some level in what Dr. Tharoor says?
May I first say that Shashi's invocation of some Swedish report and saying how innocently that these are not participants, they are observers. They are observers only because they are observers nominally, but their reports have been crafted on the strength of inputs. Exactly what we've heard now. If that's the sort of input which is being provided to the Swedes, it's only inevitable and natural that they will give this sort of a report. And I think that's quite evident. Now, here we see someone who actually contests the idea that there should be firm action when something as unique as a pandemic strikes India. That was the conventional wisdom, and that's the the lockdown method. Whenever a pandemic goes out of hand, as we are seeing in the United Kingdom today, as we are seeing in various parts of Europe today, it's the lockdown which is there now. You can have 3 grades of lockdowns or 4 grades of lockdowns, etc., and that has a tremendous economic fallout, unfortunately. And I think in India, it took a lot of courage on the part of the Prime Minister to actually say 21 days, which happened to be a 21-day lockdown. And what's even more interesting is that by and large, with the exception of the migrant labor issue, which was sorted in certain parts, which got also exaggerated to some extent, more or less the people of India actually adhered to those rather stringent, draconian health measures which were taken. And I don't see that as a reflection of the erosion of federalism. I would certainly see an erosion of responsible federalism. Those ministers, those chief ministers, those state governments, which took a casual, almost callous attitude towards this sort of the pandemic when it first arose, including giving certain generosity in terms of assembly to certain members of the community while actually imposing it for the others. A very communal view of even something as basic as health. Now, the point is, India is not necessarily becoming...
No, 1 minute. I must intervene there. I must intervene only on that point because let's be honest. Just on the community. The fact was that when the pandemic took place, there was a moment where Tablighi Jamaat individuals, when they were found to have corona, immediately you found the media almost suggesting that Muslims, or dare I say minorities, were corona carriers, which has proved to be very false. I just wonder whether
if the media is carrying it, I think
demonizing of a community is what is making us a majoritarian democracy.
That's a battle you've got to sort out in your Editors Guild or other institutions of the media. I cannot speak for the media of how they categorized it. I can only categorize, I can only cite the examples of certain parts of West Bengal, for instance, where there was no restriction on the movement in certain particular areas which are inhabited by members of a particular community, and it's not, and the lockdown affected others, where sort of random lockdown was imposed, taking into account certain Hindu festivals. So there was complete lockdown on those days.
But do you want to respond to? Do you want to respond to Dr. Tharoor's central point?
Now the point is,
do you want to respond to Dr. Tharoor's central point that we are turning to be a majoritarian democracy?
There is also,
he seems to suggest we are becoming a majoritarian democracy.
There is a majoritarian democracy. You say that for the first time, people are not squeamish or afraid of also saying, look, we have a national identity, but we also have a Hindu identity. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In the past, what had happened is you were allowed to have multiple identities, but you couldn't have a Hindu identity. Now, I think that's where the mold has been broken. It's now a reality. And today, I'm very glad Shashi thinks Jai Shri Ram
should
is
a state or a state leader identify with one religion?
I also
should the state or a state leader identify so openly with one religion, whether it's the Ram Janmabhoomi rituals that are performed or rituals in Parliament? Should they be so closely identified with one religion?
Well, that's the culture of India. If you light a lamp, if you do Bhumi Pujan, that's broadly the culture of India. And you can't take away the fact that the culture of India is to a very large extent, but not exclusively, to a very large extent, determined by what we, in a very simplistic way, call Hindu. That's what it is. Now, for instance, Jai Shri Ram has different connotations in different parts of India. Jai Shri Ram, which I'm very glad Shashi described as a very noble slogan or a noble saying, for instance, has a certain assertive quality in certain parts of North India. In Eastern India, Jai Shri Ram has suddenly picked up momentum, partly because it is seen as a form of protest. It's suddenly taken on a new meaning altogether. So these are things. But therefore, just because the majority population of India is suddenly very conscious of the fact that they too have an identity which was probably being suppressed, does not necessarily mean that the quality of Indian democracy has gone down in any meaningful sort of way. I'm sure Shashi in his book has invoked, which he gave a plug for, has invoked the Nehruvian vision. Once again, I know Jawaharlal Nehru had his own very, very, noble thoughts about various things, but doesn't mean they're cast in stone.
Okay, time for a quick break on our Democracy 2020 special debate. Shashi Tharoor and Swapan Dasgupta will be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the big democracy debate year-end special here on the news today with Shashi Tharoor and Swapan Dasgupta. Swapan, if I can get a sharp comment from you on this, when you say
I have a list of things I need to react to.
That has been passed in Uttar Pradesh, where innocent interfaith couples get arrested at times or will have to prove that their marriage took place by consensus to a DM. Do you believe that's constitutional, or do you believe that's the targeting of a community? And then I'll get Shashi to respond to that.
It cannot be a targeting of one community. It certainly is a targeting of the notion of interfaith marriage, which I believe that interfaith marriage has a certain role in India. I don't think people's personal marriage choices, voluntary marriage choices, as long as they're not coercive, can be dictated by faith. They should certainly cross. But there are a lot of silly things which happen in India, including the fact that, somebody puts in a Facebook or a Twitter post and, in Maharashtra, which is critical of the Shiv Sena, present Shiv Sena chief and chief minister, and gets done. Someone that does something similar in Bengal, it gets done. There is a lot of silliness which exists in India, and there is no doubt about it. And I think Shashi and I would both agree that there needs to be a sort of a political consensus over how we can be a little more mature when it comes to minor pinpricks which are there. But that doesn't really alter the fact.
Well, we can debate whether it's minor or not when people are put in jail for an interfaith marriage. But let Shashi Tharoor respond to your central point.
Did I say anything against interfaith marriage?
Shashi Tharoor, somewhere the sure,
Yeah, the Nehrus
sure,
may have done a lot of
Shashi
interfaith
Tharoor,
marriage.
somewhere the argument that sure, that Swapan Dasgupta is making is that the
allow me
Nehruvian
to
secularism
respond.
model may well have been an artifice, and we now have a new model. Go ahead. Respond to that.
So
Was that
first
an
of all,
artifice? And now we have something which is much more culturally rooted.
Okay. First of all, Chopin said a lot of things that I do need to respond to. For example, as he may have forgotten, I actually was an early advocate of a lockdown. I have nothing against lockdowns. I just felt that lockdown should have been instituted with due notice to people so we could have avoided something like the horrendous humanitarian tragedy of the migrant crisis with, for example, more consultation with the states. The Prime Minister gave the nation 3 days notice for a 12-hour lockdown on a Sunday. And then he imposed a 21-day lockdown with no notice at all. 3.5 hours after his speech was over, all the airports were shut, the trains were not running, the highways were gone, the interstate buses were gone. What was he thinking? And under what constitutional provision was he entitled to do that? So there are some real issues here that I'm raising. I'm not saying lockdowns were bad. I'm saying lockdown should have been done in a more democratic way. We're talking about the dangers to Indian democracy. There was one example of it that I cited. It wasn't just federalism as a theory. It was a practical thing. Employers have told me, look, if we had more time, we could have made arrangements for our workers to sleep on the factory floor, or we could have set up some communal feeding arrangements for them, as, for example, the state of Kerala did do. But Maharashtra at that point was not able to. And many of these workers were left high and dry because they had gone home at the end of a day's shift. Suddenly this lockdown announcement comes, they weren't even able to go into the street to go back and find out if there were any arrangements for them by their employers, and nor were their employers able to reach out to them. So the fact is, the lockdown was in itself not a bad idea. It was a valid response that should have come much earlier. But the BJP government preferred to waste time welcoming Trump at a super spreader event in Ahmedabad and waiting to bring down the Madhya Pradesh government before then declaring a lockdown a bit late in the day. However, so Chopin was actually tilting at a fake windmill by implying I was opposing lockdowns. I was opposing the manner in which this lockdown was implemented.
I asked
Similarly, when it comes to this question of secularism, so the entire point I'm making is it's not about Nehruvian secularism. It is about the India enshrined in the Constitution, which was written after 3 years of serious debate in the Constituent Assembly, and which gave as a fundamental premise enshrined in it access to historically inalienable set of freedoms, including the prime choice of freedom of choice. The freedom to choose what government you wanted, which Chopin has celebrated in Bihar, great. But what about the freedom to choose what set of convictions you can resonate with and express in protests in the street? The freedom to choose whom to love and how to love, and not have love jihad throwing you in jail for having done nothing more than marrying a man you wish to marry and being forced to miscarry in prison in UP, which has happened to a citizen of our country. The freedom to choose what to wear without the Prime Minister saying their clothes show their religion or their political orientation. The freedom to choose what to eat without being told that you're eating something is forbidden in some states, until, of course, a hypocritical BJP Prime Minister says, oh my God, there is a beef shortage because on both sides of my state, beef is banned and my people need beef. This kind of nonsense that's going on, the freedom of what to speak, the freedom to move freely within the sovereign borders of the Republic, the freedom to choose whether, in your view, Ram or Rahim, or Jesus or Jehovah for that matter, is the force that guides and moves the cosmos. All of these are freedoms enshrined in our Constitution. They're embedded not just in the letter, but in the spirit of the Constitution, of the laws, and into the lived experience of India and India's people. So when this government comes along and tries to press gang all of this into a sort of monolithic Hindutva version of India, it is actually against the very letter and spirit of the provisions of the Constitution. The provisions of a Constitution which treats everybody as equal, whatever their religion may be. A Constitution that says you not only have the right to worship and to have the faith you want, but to even propagate your faith, which this government would in fact be inclined to deny, and certainly in its political conduct, we're seeing that. We all want an India that's free of the shackles of communal tension. I'm sure that it's in the interest of the ruling party as well not to stoke it. And yet they seem to be unable to help themselves. That's the danger that I'm talking about. I am a great respecter of Jawaharlal Nehru's principles of secularism, but it's not the word secularism that matters to me. If you take the word secularism out of the Indian constitution, it is still a secular constitution because of the provisions I've just cited. So take the word, run away with the word. Let's talk about India's freedoms. Let's talk about the freedoms of India.
The fact is, But the fact is, Dr. Tharoor, the BJP, which has been very open about its political agenda, has won 2 successive majorities, continues to win large numbers of state elections, continues to grow as a political party, while the opposition, particularly the Congress, seems to be on retreat, at least when it comes to electoral democracy. So at the end of the day, elections are an important aspect of democracy. People are voting perhaps for the agenda that the BJP is very open about. This is not a covert agenda. This is a very open agenda of what the BJP stands for. Whether it's abolition of Article 370, whether it's building a Ram Mandir, it's always been part of their manifesto.
May I just add?
Look,
Shashi, may I just get in as a response to some of the points you made? Shashi has a belief that there is an idea of India which is enshrined in the Indian Constitution. The Indian Constitution is a very, very important document which tells us how to conduct public life, what are the rights, what are the entitlements, what are the responsibilities, if any, which certain states have, which individuals have, which the central government has. But the Constitution does not define Indian nationhood. The Constitution, the Indian nationhood goes back much deeper. And the new ideas of Indian nationhood are something which cannot ever be codified. And I think that's very important to actually stress that point. Today, we had a bizarre situation in real life where people could invoke Rahim, where people could invoke Jehovah, but it was illegitimate to invoke Ram. Now, I think that balance has now been struck. Today, one of the biggest achievements, I think, which I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, was that the construction of the Ram Temple, which has been a source of discord in certain parts of the country, has actually been effected legally as well as peacefully. That, to my mind, is a very, very important step. And it's only right that the sentiments of a vast majority of people have been accommodated without in any way depriving any other section of the community of their rights to live as free Indians. And I think this is a very important point. That
Dr. Tharoor, you want a quick let Dr. Tharoor have a quick response, because I want to come to one last point.
No. We assume that giving Hindus rights means stealing the rights of other communities. If that had been the case, India would never have been a tolerant place. Indian history would have been a very different thing. And, our constitution may have looked very, very different. But that's not the case. The point is, India is tolerant. India is secular. India is a democracy, partly because the vast majority of Hindus actually agree with those notions. And that's the point which I think. But they still retain their identity.
Let Dr. Tharoor respond quickly to you, because I want to then come to one final point. Go ahead, Dr. Tharoor.
But I have to correct Swapan's idea that the Constitution does not specify the nature of Indian nationhood. They debated precisely this question. There were people who said, now that Pakistan has been created as a country for India's Muslims, should we not become a country for India's Hindus? And this was debated and thrashed out extensively, and the opposite conclusion was arrived at, that we will not accept the logic of partition, that our freedom struggle was a struggle for everybody, and we will create a country for everybody. So Indian nationhood, its pluralism, its secularity was absolutely a conscious choice of the Constituent Assembly. And please, Swapan, read my book. If you have any doubts about this, you'll find chapter and verse there.
No, your publisher has been kind enough to send me one. I will.
I know. I had asked him.
Just a minute.
Let me finish, because there is one more point.
Yeah,
Swapan's arguments today are reducing democracy to electoral victory. And I'm sorry, Rajdeep, your question was also the same thing. People are voting for them. Well, 37% of India has voted for the BJP, and 31 the previous 5 years ago. That is not, to my adequate for them to claim, as they do, that this is a referendum on the popular will. That's the first point. But secondly, our constitution also has created, and laws subsequently have created, non-elected autonomous institutions that are supposed to provide checks and balances on the overweening power of the elected executive. The judiciary, the media, civil society, NGOs, the Election Commission, the Reserve Bank, all of these, frankly, by insisting that they must honor the electoral verdict and not have views at variance with that of the ruling party, the populist approach of this government has been to constrain the functioning of all of these institutions, to delegitimize dissent, to obstruct protests and even lock up protesters for days, if not weeks, to challenge essentially the fundamental workings of the spirit of the Constitution in this way. So my view is that we have to restore, empower, and renew the institutions of the civic nationalism established by the Constitution of India. You know, when the very Bhumi Pujan that Chopin was citing is actually unconstitutional, because the Constitution says Parliament is headed by the President and has two chambers. And neither the head of one chamber, who outranks the Prime Minister in protocol terms, nor the President was invited. And the Prime Minister, who strictly speaking is only the head of government and has no role in the establishment of Parliament, performs a Bhumi Pujan. It's actually cocking a snook at, if not being absolutely disrespectful of, the very Constitution itself. So the Constitution is something this BJP has never had a lot of respect for.
Which comes...
the man whom Prime Minister has hailed as his...
I guess, Shashi, you would say that the original copy of the Constitution...
Which comes to the question I was going to raise. Shashi has taken the question which I want to raise to Dr. Dasgupta. Are institutions being subservient to the individual? Dr. Dasgupta, are institutions being subservient to the individual? Whether it's the courts, whether it's the media, whether it's Parliament, whether it's executive, whether it's Election Commission, whether it's CBI, whether it's Enforcement Directorate, whether it's when MPs are bought and sold, or indeed when there is poaching, is all of that undermining, diminishing democracy is what I want to ask you, Dr. Dasgupta. Are you being far too sanguine at the moment?
I feel that Shashi is guilty of an absolute travesty when he compares the judiciary with the media and the NGOs. Now, these belong to very, very different categories in terms of their importance. Importance they all are. NGOs' importance are a little more, dodgy about it. I don't really find that. But in any case, the point is none of these institutions have in any way been affected in their functioning. What has happened is that after a prolonged period of dithering coalition rule, we have come to a point where the government actually believes that it is its mandate to try and change and put India on a footing so that we can be one of the more developed countries in the world. This requires a firm, decisive action in certain respects.
Sure, but not by subverting institutions. Not by subverting institutions. Not by subverting institutions, using the Enforcement Directorate to target your political opponents.
Rajdeep, the problem with some people is that the moment they don't like a particular judicial verdict, they believe that that institution has been subverted. A lot of them didn't like the verdict on Ram Janmabhoomi. So they say the entire institution has been subverted. So the law is what I say it is. That's what their thing is. Now that is not a prescription for any healthy democracy. And just because a certain wing, say the judiciary or the Reserve Bank, endorses a particular point of view of the executive, doesn't make it a more truncated or a shrinking democracy, nor does it make it an illiberal democracy or does it suggest a creeping authoritarianism. It doesn't. Yes, there are a lot of things which we can do to make the Indian democracy much more wholesome. We can make it even better. And I think it should be all our endeavor, both the opposition and the ruling party, to actually put their heads together. But let's not forget that in between having shouted wolf, wolf, wolf all the time, the Congress is today a shrinking commodity. And the real problem, the real challenge of democracy has been, as far as they can see it, actually the remarkable shrinkage of a once great national party to being reduced to a rump and a family commodity.
Okay, that's another debate for another day. But I want the two of you to end on a brighter note. You know, we are ending the year. What's been a long and difficult year, and I want to ask both of you, as you look ahead to 2021, Shashi Tharoor, do you have a resolution, a hope for the future for India, for its democracy? 30 seconds. What would you really like to see that you don't see today?
I'd like to see an India where you won't get lynched for the food you eat, marginalized for the faith you hold dear, criminalized for the person you love, or imprisoned for making use of fundamental rights guaranteed by your own constitution, but rather an India that celebrates and welcomes diversity and pluralism, that actually accepts difference and feels it's a strength and not something that divides us. And I hope an India where we can focus much more on the needs of a shared future than being divided by a bitter version of the past. That, unfortunately, is not the India that this particular government has chosen to promote in the last 6 years. I don't think it's too late to change. If Swapan says we should put our heads together and agree, I hope this is a point we can agree on. We need a future for our people. And I do want to add one more point, since we did talk about COVID mismanagement. Let's, in a more positive light, say that the COVID crisis has made it clear that we cannot fight a pandemic nationally without taking the local along. Instructions from a distant Delhi could not prevent the virus from spreading. And the migrant crisis also showed us that Indians are tied emotionally to the places they're from, much more than to the places they live in for the exigencies of their work. So why don't we try and create a much more empowered and decentralized India, not the kind of top-down, heavy-handed political direction that we've been seeing out of our present government, and instead create opportunities to empower ordinary Indians in the villages, in their local areas, in the states, give them the right to be themselves, leave them alone so they can eat what they want and love who they want without being locked up and punished. And at the same time, once you've defended that, then let us celebrate all the unity of India, not uniformity, unity. And let's pursue consensus, not conformity. Let's not try and impose one view of India on this large and diverse country, because that will be a recipe for disaster. If we accept difference, we accept each other as we are and as we want to be, I think we can still make a success story out of our India in the future.
Well, I'm very reassured that Shashi...
Dr. Dasgupta, a final word therefore for you. Your hope for the future of India of 2021. I know your home state of Bengal and indeed Shashi's home state of Kerala also going to the polls, but your dream for 2021.
Well, in a sense, my vision for India in the coming year is actually tempered and colored to a large extent by what's happening in Bengal. I really wish for a position, or a state of affairs where people can go and vote peacefully without having someone looking over their shoulders. I hope for a situation where it is possible for political activity to be conducted without the methods of police raj. I really wish for a situation where extended forms of governance are replaced by something predictable. I wish for a situation where people in Bengal, and I endorse what Shashi has said, can be a little vocal about local by having opportunities at their doorstep, which don't necessarily mean that they have to end up as migrant labor, have a one-way ticket economy, nor do I want a money audit economy. I believe that all regions in India have the potential of flourishing. I believe that all Indians have a right to actually get their livelihood and have a government which can actually promote their local concerns in a meaningful way. I also wish for an India where there is a sense of history, there is a sense of belonging, which translates into every single region, where no region is actually discriminated against, where you have a view of India which is more embracing, which takes into account all the local differences, but at the same time keeps in mind the fundamental unity of what I call Bharat Mata, which I celebrate as Bharat Mata, which you might actually think of as in some other way. I believe that we are doing reasonably well in some respects. There are some minefields, there are some hurdles and obstacles in the path, which is inevitable in any democracy, which is inevitable in any challenge. But today, I think, after the pandemic, despite the dip in certain of our economic indicators, I think overall we can go ahead and say that today we are a little more proud to be Indian in a larger world community. That was the case earlier. And I wish this is not to actually berate everything which happened in the past, but only to say that we've got time to go. But I think the pride in being Indian, the pride we are beginning to feel in ourselves, in our own ability to create things, is something which is noteworthy, which is something which is laudable. And I hope in the coming days we move along this path in a little more purposeful manner. And certainly some of the more irritable things or irritating things which are there in our system gradually gets ironed out. As far as the identity of our Indians are concerned, I think it's assured, but there are some people who still have fragmentary views on India. I hope they will change, and I hope their views will not be sanctified and legitimized by intellectuals who, in the name of pluralism, will actually end up promoting vivisection or a form of emotional balkanization of India.
That's it then on the big Democracy 2020 year-end debate. Thank you both very much for joining me, Shashi Tharoor, Swapan Dasgupta. Remember, democracy is something this country has fought for. We need to treasure it, and we need to ensure that we, the citizens, preserve it. Thanks for watching. Happy New Year. Bye for now.
Thank you.